You are listening to the audio project with Deena Tearney. This podcast is recorded from my office in downtown Honolulu and welcomes you to join in the conversations I have on technology, business, and all things Salesforce. All right, cool. So kicking off the podcast again in the studio today, which is my office. I'm sitting with Nick Redding, and super happy to have you here. You and I have known each other for a few years. Yeah, I was gonna say I feel like it's more than 2, but yeah.
Not long after I got here. Yeah, I've been here a little over 3 years. So,
okay, so there you go.
Yeah. The project that I approached you with is something I started early on. So
okay, cool. I will say this: when I first met you, and I think we just had an initial phone call, and obviously we've had multiple discussions since then, I immediately knew, number one, Nick is really, really smart. And number two, I knew that you had a passion for driving change and elevating Hawaii and making an impact in our state. And I admired, obviously both of those traits right away.
Oh, thank you.
I think for context, it might be good to just start with an overview of yourself, and then we can lead into and kind of dive into some of the work that you're doing at the moment, because I think it's super interesting, and I'm interested to hear what's new. So
sure, yeah. So I came to Hawaii 3 years ago, as I said, and before that I had been in New York City finishing up my doctorate in social organizational psychology. So that focuses on the science of organizations and how people work together and how organizations can change, in desired directions. And I worked on lots of interesting things there, and actually a lot of times it wasn't organization science. A big part of my work was in a lab that studied conflict and conflict resolution, and we were employing some very interesting approaches to doing that were systems informed. So taking a systems thinking approach that conflicts are situated within a broader system of social and other forces that serve to either move that conflict in a certain direction or hold it in place. And so when I was close to dissertating, I decided to activate my network, and in the process of doing that research, I had connected with the Midyar group by way of one of my mentors, who was a systems thinking guru who had actually been hired by the Midyar group to start to work with organizations within to bring a systems thinking lens. And so I said, hey, is there anything cool happening there? And they said, well, Hawaii is actually looking for somebody like you. And I always tell the story of asking my wife where she would be interested in moving to. And we were in New York at the time, and she said I'll move somewhere that's at least as warm as here in the summer, so we can go to the beach, and it needs to always be near the ocean. And so I always say, I think Hawaii was a slam dunk. You can't get closer to the ocean than this.
No argument on that.
I mean, here it is December, and you can still go to the beach. So that was easy. And I've been here 3 years, and I wasn't, I think we're going to talk more about some data work I've been doing.
I would love to hear about that. Yeah.
That actually wasn't why I was brought here, so I can talk about that, or we could just go right into...
Either way.
Okay. Yeah, so I was, I'm a social researcher by training, and so I'm still housed within the Ulupono Initiative, which is a local impact investment firm focused on renewable energy, food, waste, sustainable waste and water practices. And so that's where I sit. But I also was invited to just kind of split my time with other projects that were happening. And one was this project that had been initiated out of the Hawaii Leadership Forum to just understand a little better the well-being of communities across the state, and to use data to bring that understanding. And this came from kind of just an observation and doing work here that oftentimes the data we might want to understand communities that might be in need, or to understand where we might want to focus our efforts writ large, or to be able to measure the impact of what we're doing. It wasn't always easy to get that data. And so this project was kind of a first attempt at doing something about that, starting an index of well-being. And the index project didn't go very well for a lot of reasons that we're still kind of sorting out. But what we did find is there is a lot of existing data here in the state that is very useful if it's just if we're able to do a little bit with it to make it more accessible to a broader audience of stakeholders. And so that's why we decided to start the Hawaii Data Collaborative.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I was kind of curious what the journey was and what that transition point was. So the Hawaii Data Collaborative project, that one, how recent is that? And what sort of
So we've been at this project for 2.5 years, but we branded as Hawaii Data Collaborative earlier this year, and then we just recently started actually putting it out there. So hawaiidata.org is the website, and it's been live, soft launch, and that has the tools and some of the background of what we've been doing. That we have now out there as kind of a platform for then, starting to have the next step conversations about what we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, it looks really cool. I was taking a look at the latest. It looks super awesome. What was the journey to get to this point, like the point that we can see now? Like, what was the journey for you guys, like behind the scenes? Yeah, no worries.
It was a lot. I mean, because first of all, going back to my background, this is a new area of data and research for me. And so, for me, the personal journey has been hitting the books, hitting the, looking for models out there, things like that, and getting really excited about the possibilities. Plugging into the Urban Institute has something called the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is a bunch of organizations like what we aspire to be, which are local, usually nonprofit, sometimes university housed centers, but a lot of times standalone nonprofits that focus on elevating data in communities for broader utility. And so I've really enjoyed kind of getting up to speed on the different models for going about that and different approaches. And then, we talk about well-being. What the heck is that, right? Like, it's kind of like happiness. It doesn't really have an easy definition, yet we know it's a thing. And so you have to, in terms of data, you have to start to operationalize that. And so we have to come up with a model, or actually say framework of well-being, and it's 10 domains on there: health and economic opportunity and housing and safety and security and all the, education, et cetera. And so we have to learn kind of what those are, and then how do you measure those things, and so it's it's really it's big, and trying to figure out like what's the right size for us to do at each stage of what we're doing. Like, we don't need to become experts on all these things. We just need to be informed enough to know, like, are we being helpful by putting data in front of people across these things. And so that was a big part of the journey, was just kind of scoping and getting up to speed enough to feel like we, to get the confidence that we could actually put something out there that's helpful. And then, of course, actually getting the data. It's interesting, that you're familiar with a lot of different data sets, and like the census data that's out there, it's great. I mean, there's so many different ways to extract census data and do what you might want to with it. And that's a lot of indicators rely on that, and that's common across the country. It's one of our best data collection efforts we have. But there's lots of other data we have in the state, our school data, the education data in our schools, data on crime rates, data from the departments of health and things like that, that is also great data, but it all comes in different formats. It's shared differently, everything from downloadable data to PDF reports. Oh, gosh. And so, you have to, figure out, are we going to scrape that, and how are we going to scrape that, and are we going to, and then another thing is that oftentimes there are different region schemes, because one of the things we're really interested in when we talk about communities is that you have to actually operationalize that as well. It's like, here's the line on the map that defines this community, and it turns out different agencies have different schemes for that. So the Department of Human Services scheme differs from the Department of Health scheme.
How do you deal with that?
And so I had to learn about that, and so and plug in with people who do GIS work and things like that. And there's this thing called crosswalking, which is actually using census data and census tables. And I don't want to geek out too much, but it basically says, like if you kind of understand, if you use the census scheme and then you have a GIS layer that overlays on that, you can actually get a sense of the proportion of residents that overlap the two regions. And so when you have a region, so say a school complex overlaps two different zip codes, you can actually get a sense of, okay, well, how much of, what's the proportion that sits within this zip code, and what's the proportion that sits within this other zip code, and then you assign data values to them, proportionally allocate them, and kind of do a re-aggregation of that. And so and then there's a way to kind of to validate that and stuff like that. So we had to learn about that. We worked with you guys to build some tools that let us do that quickly, because I'm not a coder, I'm not a programmer, and so there's a lot of things to do that if you were to try to do that manually, wouldn't be worth it. So we figured that out. We're happy to make that available to people, but nobody's asking. But one of the things that at this time, but we hope down the road, because eventually we hope that people will want to start to translate the data we found into whatever work they're doing. And so that's when I say, like, we're working to make data more accessible. It's the follow-on is to explain what I just explained, which is not just that I can get to it, because that's already the case, right? All this data is just a few clicks away in your web browser. But accessible is it in the format I need to do the analysis I want? Is it in the scheme I need to see it on the map the way I would want? And then also, even given those two things, you know, we didn't want to just put a data file out there of cleaned up, transformed data. It's also for people who don't do data work or don't have the time or anything like that. Can we also make it accessible in terms of there's a tool right there to start looking at it?
Right, help them interact with it much more easy. And
so it took us a while to even see, like, that's actually that's actually what, you know, the phases of how we rolled out the data collaborative were really like, let's just help get more data out there. And as we would reach each milestone we set for ourselves, it's like, but is this going to move the needle on anything?
Right.
No. Okay, we need to build tools so people can work with us. So we do that. And then the most recent iteration this year was, well, is that going to move the needle on anything? And probably not. You know, just by putting data in front of people or making it available might not necessarily change. Even, you know, we're hearing that it's helpful, but that's different than impact, right? And so what we've been thinking about now is like, okay, well, what foundation have we built, and what's the next step? And so we're looking forward to next year continuing that platform and building on it and iterating it, but also showing how that is actually a foundation for doing deeper dive analyses.
Yeah, one of the things that's super interesting, it's cool to see the journey, and I think you're right, like, it's a building block to the next bit, and as people start interacting with it, I think you start to figure out what to do. But I kind of wanted to step back a little bit to all these data sources that you guys have gotten your hands on that are, like you said, publicly available, you can get and do something with, and you've done a lot of transformations with it. One thing that you and I were chatting about was just data discovery and that experience that you've had as you've gone through this process of just preparing it for consumption on the Hawaii Data Collaborative. Did you have any, like, cool discoveries kind of along the way? Were there some eye-opening moments when you did that? And how did you do it? Like, how does it come to be? Because I think people think there's this magic to it, and I'm just kind of curious, like, what was your experience going through that data discovery process?
Your listeners can't see me smiling, so I'm smiling right now. Because it's a common question that we get. And it's funny because if you're not looking for insights, they don't necessarily come out. And so I'm skirting your question a little bit, but we can come back to it, which is that's often what I get asked. And it's interesting because what I often respond to is, well, what surprising things would you like to learn about? And the reason I say that is because and there's a couple, like I like to say sometimes, like the data doesn't speak for itself. The data doesn't dance for you, things like that, because sometimes the expectations that come to us is, oh, well, by virtue of doing what you did, new insights must have emerged. And at least from my background, that's not how data really works. Like sometimes, we're in the era of big data and data science and all these things like that. And when you have huge data sets where you can run all sorts of different things to see how data points cluster, people cluster, all these things like that, that can happen. But often, I don't want to say the right way, but the way that I think yields the most insights is when you start with questions, when you actually bring your theory of the system to the data and say, look, I think this is what's going on. And then you use tools like this to test that. And our platform doesn't say, hey, you should see this. Look at this. There's a disparity of 20 years in life expectancy across these census tracts. That's a surprising finding. Nice. Okay. But it doesn't, that's not what we might highlight that with a deeper dive, but it doesn't do that. So that's actually been a challenge with the platform is, people kind of get in there and they're like, well, now what? And I think they kind of hope to be guided through it. And so we often just say, well, what are you interested in? And oftentimes it's an organization that's doing work. So what are you guys working on? Oh, early childhood. Well, let's see what data we have on that. And, there's a couple of data points directly to that, but then what do you think's related to that? What else, when you're looking at communities in terms of early childhood outcomes, what else relates to that? What else do you think relates to that? Those are hypotheses. Let's test them. Let's see. And there's a tool that lets you generate very simple scatter plots of communities to say, let's put percent enrolled of 3 to 4 year olds enrolled in early childhood education on one axis, and let's put median household income on the other, for communities. Do you think that's related? That higher income communities have more enrolled. That's a hypothesis you can test really quickly. So it's that kind of orientation we're trying to get people to bring to it. And then of course that just raises a whole new set of questions that eventually, a platform like ours is not going to be sufficient. And so then that's what we're thinking about now, is how do we support that next step?
Gotcha.
You come in, you might be interested in a topic and you can see how it spreads out across the map. You might be interested in a specific community and you can see what's going on there, how that community relates, or where that community stands relative to other communities on different, indicators of well-being. But then, that's an early pass, but then that's going to raise more questions. And what we want to be able to show is like, how might you take those up? How might you then engage in further inquiry to gain an even deeper understanding, learn more, things like that.
That's crazy. That's cool. Yeah. So it hasn't necessarily been a discovery, but it's more the journey and the exercise of going through that, or maybe testing, a question and then being proven like either wrong, or like maybe not wrong is not right, but just driving you to the next level and saying, okay, now what?
Yeah, exactly. So, it might be supported, because there's another thing what we run into sometimes that I call narrative in search of data, which is, there's a tendency to take the understanding we have of the system and look for data that supports that.
Yeah,
and
that's natural.
Then that's natural, and sometimes there might be a place for that. So I'm not passing any judgment, but that's psychologically that's like a confirmation bias, right? So in inquiry terms, if there truly is a curiosity about what's happening in the system and what might influence positive change, then the step back is helpful, right? To say, well, here's the story I'd like to think is happening, and maybe it's because I've invested a lot of time and energy and resources into doing something about that. But if you're able to step back and say, well, look, this is what I'm interested in. This is the vision I have for the system. This is where I'd like it to go. And then you can use the data to say, well, where should I start? Yeah. That's much more productive.
So tell me about, with the project itself, at the stage that it's at now, how do you go out and evangelize it, or how do people? I'm just kind of curious about the engagement, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, we have. I haven't used evangelizing, but it could be. We've been thinking a lot about who might be interested in it, and we've been getting it in front of a lot of people.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's purely like, hey, this might be helpful to you. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's, hey, this might be helpful to what you're trying to do. Would you partner with us? Those kinds of conversations.
That's cool.
There's kind of those where we think there's an opportunity to unlock new data, new analyses, and there's a partner out there that would want to do that. So maybe they have data and say, hey, look, here's what we've done so far. We know you guys have some data that right now is not publicly available. Would you be interested in a partnership? We would get out of it getting more data out there for people to be able to work with, and you would get out of it some deeper analysis, something like that. So there's all sorts of different ways we're talking to people based on what we think might be helpful. But we're always, we are constantly sharing just what we've done, and always including like where we think it should go.
Yeah, that's good. So there's some guidance.
Yeah, and that one's been honestly more of a challenge. And I just had a meeting about this earlier, of just like, how do we talk about what this thing is? Because people are used to hearing like, here's a very specific roadmap. Here's a project. We're going to study this thing. It's going to involve these people and take this amount of time. And it's like we actually need to build the foundation to have those conversations. Saying like, hey, there's just a role for an organization like this to be in the community and start to partner and support these kinds of things.
That's cool. So response been positive.
Yeah. Very much so.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I think that's the first thing, is sort of like, what is it? What does it do? And I think you've clarified that for the decision making. How did you come up with the framework for well-being?
So it's based on commonly used domains of well-being. So one source that's really inspiring to us is the Legatum. The Legatum Institute in the UK has something called the Legatum Prosperity Index, which that goes for a circle.
I remember you and I talked about this way back. Yep.
And so that is, that's kind of what sparked the interest in doing an index of well-being. And that's a country to country comparison, and so that that there's, like I said, the index didn't work out as well, but they did a really good job of doing the background research, like looking at what does the empirical literature base say about what influences well-being, and then actually using existing data to test some of that out, doing some modeling and things to say, like, when we look at all 49 countries or whatever in the data set, they could actually kind of run some numbers and say, okay, these are the indicators that really pop out. These are the domains that cluster together, stuff like that. So, we use that, not the World Bank. No, it'll come to me, but there's another really good, multi-governmental organization that's working on something like that. And they have a similar, kind of model of well-being, and then we looked at some other stuff, and so it's kind of what we say is it's a framework. So I even backed off from model, because model suggests it's predictive, and say no, it's more like a way to take something very complex and simplify it just enough that we can start to take it up. And so we say it's defensible because it's certainly something that we actually want to work with the community here in Hawaii to iterate on. To say, hey, it might be 12 domains, it might be 8, it could be some other kind of thing. So
no, it looks good. I drilled down and it makes a lot of sense. It's cool. So it's really the collection of a few different data points that you kind of came together and said, this is what we're going to land on, at least for the time being. Okay, cool. So my background being consulting and working with you guys and other people is all about execution. And I'm super interested, just for our audience, like, to get to this point, which by the way is really impressive. What was the execution like for you? I mean, just from a more, I know you talked about taking those and then kind of grinding it down and then working with a team. Like, I feel like the approach that you've had has been a bit iterative, and I was just wondering, like, how technical did things have to go? How what challenges did you face kind of in the execution of creating this?
It's interesting because we didn't, the where we are now is not where we sought to go originally, and that's the iterative part of it. So what we actually wanted to do was just take the data that we had pulled together and make it useful for kind of a more of an internal group of stakeholders to start. And that's where we ended up with Tableau, and that's how we found you guys. And it was kind of like, okay, well, Tableau seems right because it's something that there's a lot of different things you can do with data quickly in that platform. And so let's start with that. And so we started to learn it, and we worked with you guys and start to put the data in there. And we realized, like, but Tableau, as easy as it is still, it's not something you just, if you have no background, just go right in and use. So what do we do about that? And then finding, like, well, Tableau has a whole public facing, you can make interactive dashboards and all that stuff. And so we started to play around with that and say, okay, well, for this internal group of stakeholders, let's see if we can make it interactive so they don't actually have to go into Tableau. They can just go to some sort of web interface or something like that. And then as that's starting to be successful, it's like, well, why are we just keeping this internal? Why don't we, make this more broadly available? Which then, of course, you have to package it. And so it's kind of actually the thing grew out of it. So we didn't seek to start a new nonprofit that's doing these things. We started with, hey, we just want to get some better data together and see where it leads us. And then kind of the technical implementation also led us to kind of discovering what the thing really is that we wanted to do. So, I mean, different than execution with, like, you need to start a new organization that's oriented this way by this time. We didn't have that, but at the same time, there was always a drive. Like, we need to reach some milestone of utility from this, and then each time we hit that milestone, be like, but it could be more. And then
that's that's the reason I brought it up, because I thought it was really cool, in talking with the team and hearing about the work that you guys were doing. Is I felt like it's a nice approach because sometimes we have other people that we work with, and it's like, this is very directive, this is what we're accomplishing, this is where we're going. Whereas with you guys, I felt like it's just this pivot. Like, you're going, you're trying, and then you pivot again, and then you're like, all right, now there's the next level. And as you go, you've kind of been creating as you go and letting it sort of define itself, which I think is a pretty cool approach. So I was curious if you had lessons learned or other tips that you might share with others kind of on a journey similar. About how to approach it.
I mean, I feel very fortunate that my partners in this have been very open to that exploration, because I know how challenging it can be in other contexts where you whether it's a grant or something like that, where it's like, it's kind of predefined. Like, once you start, you've got to go down that path. And so, I mean, we had the luxury of not having to do the pre-work that otherwise you would want to do, of, like, actually get out there, talk to people. Because that was something else with our project is, early on it was, we knew we wanted to do something like this big. Once we figured out that the data that was available mattered and could be used for broader utility, we kind of thought, well, should we go out and have a lot of conversations and talk to people and say, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing, or should we just do it and then get reactions to it? And so that was one point that we had probably the flexibility to be able to do. And we like it a lot better, but it's also, recognize that sometimes that's not always possible. But, given the experience we've had, it definitely seems like it was right, because it's much harder for people to talk to something that doesn't exist versus like, here's the thing, here, break it. Critique it, work with it,
figure it out. Exactly.
All those kinds of things. And so, because we thought about like, hey, should we go to the agencies and see how would they like to help us get data and all that stuff? And that's a tall ask of an agency to get comfortable with making data available publicly that they haven't yet made available. And so you kind of like, what would we do to be able to build confidence in us to be able to do that with them? And so, that was another thing, is like this kind of shows that we're serious about it. Like we've done some hard work, and we're also we want to continue to do that hard work. I think it kind of allowed people to see that we've made this investment, and we want to partner to like make it better. And we're not married to anything we've done. So all of it is negotiable in terms of where it goes, because it's for the it's for the community. It's not for us.
Exactly.
And one of the things we've been talking about a lot and trying to get the language right when we talk about it is like, the data collaborative, if you think about the name Hawaii, that makes sense. It's about this place. Data, that makes sense too. Collaborative. Okay. So it's like elevating data together is what you see on the website. And it's that, whole idea. And so, that's where we're really kind of, putting out those next steps to say, look, we're kind of going to end up central to some important data conversations, at least we hope to, but not because we want to be central, because that's just a kind of a starting point. But ultimately what we want to do is like create an environment where connections around data happen naturally. That's just what Hawaii does. Like, people want to understand something, they come together, policymakers and the private sector and analysts up at UH, et cetera. So that's ultimately like where we want to go, is the collaborative piece. Is this is something that we're all doing together.
Cool, very cool. Any final words? Because I have some stuff I'm gonna say, but I want to ask you if you have any other points that maybe we didn't touch on that might be informative for. I mean, there's one other
thing that I evangelize a lot, which is, there's a lot of interesting conversations happening around there. There's a lot right now, and there's a lot of excitement about data, and there's a lot of excitement about, making change and using data to drive that. And one of the things that, I'm carrying from academia especially is this, real caution about working too much with the data we have. And it's, it's something I've been I think a lot about, which is if we have the data in front of us now and it can inform our decisions, but we have to always ask ourselves, like, is this the data? It's the data we have, but is it the data we need to make decisions? And that's a harder one, because it's like, and it's another part of that kind of step back that it takes that other approaches sometimes don't offer, is like, well, what is this thing we want to do?
Exactly.
And then, how would we measure it? And then we find, there's some data on it, but there's other data that we don't have. And just hold, and that shouldn't limit action, but it should at least make the understandings we hold tentative. And what we're hoping to do is kind of build out an agenda, a shared agenda for how do we get the data we don't have that we need. So like, we have all this data and great data from various agencies and stuff, but there's all these other aspects of well-being in Hawaii that we don't know much about at all. And we need to take action now, because people are living their lives right now and could use some help and all those things like that. But they also, at the same time, I think in parallel, we need to be thinking, how do we get better at measuring all of this? And so that's one last comment I would make that I push a lot.
It ties together. It ties everything together, right? So take a step back, figure out what are you trying to understand, and then what do we have? How would we answer that? What would we need to answer that? How do we get that? It makes perfect sense, and I think it's very applicable for a variety of use cases, not just well-being in Hawaii. So super good. So thank you for being on my podcast, and I noticed that you have a fun fact.
I do.
That you are really, you enjoy listening to podcasts. So I'm very flattered that you would be willing to join my podcast.
Yeah. No, that's my my walking routine. I
That's
walk
your
to
walk
work,
routine.
and
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's cool. I saw that on there, and I remember this is a small thing, but I remember the first time I met you, and you walked in, and you had in person because we had talked many times, but you had a book. What was that book? You had like a data science book of some sort.
Oh, really?
And you were like, oh yeah, Deena, I got this book. And so every time I see you, I'm always like, oh, he's got some new thing that he's after and some new information. And then when I saw that you're into podcasts, I was like, okay, this all adds up.
Yeah, it's there's just so many people talking about so many great things.
True.
It's just nice to be able to plug into that.
Yeah.
Freakonomics is one that.
Yes.
And it's just the creativity and some of the stories that they tell about how economists tackle big problems with the data they have.
Yeah.
And like they talk a lot about natural experiments and all these things. It's just really like very, very applied, data that, it's something we would aspire to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, let's, like how do we take on some of these big challenges and try to get at what might be happening. And,
Yeah. I'm sure you've applied many things that you've learned through those podcasts and other educational bits of information that are available. But thank you for being on the podcast. It meant a lot that that you would join me. So I appreciate it. And we'll have to have you back and like get the latest updates.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right.